Grand Canyon Lodge was 88 years old when it was destroyed by the Dragon Bravo fire on the night of July 12, 2025. The fire, which stayed small for several days, had been started by a lightning strike on the north side of the park on the evening of July 4th. But on July 10th, the fire blew up, and by the next day the Park Service was evacuating guests and concession employees. Then on the afternoon of the 12th, the blaze ripped through the water treatment facility, releasing chlorine gas into the air. Because of this, firefighters were also evacuated, and air support was grounded, leaving the historic lodge and cabins defenseless. When a person dies, what we remember is their life, not their death. So let's do that with Grand Canyon Lodge. Hello and welcome to Canyon Whispers. I'm your host, Rebecca. Anyone who knows me knows that I love to talk about all things Grand Canyon, and that it's difficult to get me to shut up. So it only made sense for me to start a podcast. I was already preparing some episodes when I heard the news about Grand Canyon Lodge, so I got busy working on what is now going to be my first episode. I personally never got to see the lodge up close, or any of the North Rim. The closest I got was a particular spot on the lower half of North Kaibab Trail where the lodge was just visible in the distance. But I have enjoyed learning about its history, and hopefully you will too. So let's get to it. Before there was a lodge, there was the Wiley Way Camp, which from what I can gather was the early 20th century version of glamping. This camp operated on Bright Angel Point from 1917 to 1927 until they were forced to sell out to the Utah Parks Company, a subsidiary of the Union Pacific Railroad. The Park Service had opened up bidding to get an actual concessionaire for the North Rim, and none of the small-timers who were already in the area could afford to do it. So after winning the bid, the Utah Parks Company hired architect Gilbert Stanley Underwood, who had already designed Old Faithful Lodge in Yellowstone, the Bryce Canyon Lodge, the Ahwahnee in Yosemite, and the original Zion Lodge. For this project, Underwood envisioned a lodge with cabins radiating out from either end. He placed the lodge right on the cliff edge and designed the Kaibab limestone exterior to look like it was meant to be there. The log and stone cabins were set farther back along wandering paths. The lodge had an observation tower, a veranda on top of the main room, and two terraces on either side to provide ample viewing space. But the main room, or the sun room as it was called, was the true centerpiece. Underwood designed the lodge in a sort of U-shape, and the fact that the road came right up to it made it so that anyone approaching the lodge wouldn't be able to see the canyon. So guests would come in through the lobby, go down a short flight of stairs into the sunroom, and get their first look at the canyon through three huge windows. It must have felt like they were looking at three giant paintings. I, at least, have always felt, when viewing the canyon from the South Rim, that what I'm seeing is an enormous matte painting, like were sometimes used in old Hollywood movies when they needed a background that they couldn't get in real life. It just seems too amazing to be real. Construction began sometime after May 1927. 125 men were hired to work on the project, and they were paid anywhere from 50 cents to 85 cents an hour, which would be the equivalent of $9.24 to $15.70 today. They harvested trees from the adjacent Kaibab National Forest, and a stone quarry was established within the park about 2 miles north of the lodge site. Along with the cabins and the lodge, a pump house and hydroelectric facility had to be built in Roaring Springs Canyon on the east side of Bright Angel Point. Before this, water for the Wiley Way Camp and other establishments had come from a series of springs in Transept Canyon on the west side of the point, but they would not have provided enough for the new complex. The system would pump water over 3,500 vertical feet up to a 50,000-gallon tank on the rim, and when it was completed, it was the highest single-stage water lift in the whole world. The pump house was built right by the spring, and the powerhouse was built about 3/4 of a mile down the canyon. Water was pumped up to the rim, as I previously mentioned, and it was also sent down a pipe to the powerhouse where its energy was converted to electricity. Power lines followed the pipe back to the spring house, then on up to the rim. Men worked through the winter, dealing with up to 6 feet of snow, and the road had to be kept clear so that trucks could transport supplies and building materials. But their rotary snowplow wasn't heavy enough to move through all that snow under its own power, so they had to source a surplus tank from World War I to push it. Working during wintertime also caused problems with the stone. Any moisture that had gotten into cracks would freeze and weaken the rocks, causing a lot of them to crack. So the men did their best to thaw them around a fire before putting them in place. This was especially annoying to Underwood, who had specified that the huge outdoor fireplace on the eastern terrace was to have one long piece of stone as its lintel. But when the masons were laying it, it broke apart. So they ended up making the lintel out of 3 stones so that they could continue with their work, but promised that they would replace it with one in the spring after things had warmed up. They never did. Grand Canyon Lodge and its 120 cabins opened on June 5, 1928. Staff lined up to greet guests arriving on Union Pacific motor coaches from the railroad station in Cedar City, Utah. But 4 years later, during the early morning hours of September 1st, 1932, a fire broke out. No one seemed to be able to agree on where it started. One account says it started in the kitchen while the chef was preparing breakfast. But in another newspaper, they quote the chief clerk saying that it did not start in the kitchen. And then there's the memo that the Utah Parks Company office sent to the Union Pacific, which states that it started in the ladies' toilet. How a fire starts in a bathroom, I don't know. But no matter where or how it started, it burned up the lodge and 2 of the nearby cabins. The silver lining is that everyone got out safely. The Utah Parks Company immediately said that they were going to rebuild. But remember that this was during the Great Depression, so it wasn't going to happen right away. They did, however, build a temporary lodge in 1933 that was basically just a cafeteria and recreation space. And over the next 2 years, they added an employee dormitory, a service station, more cabins, though they did not bother to rebuild the 2 that had burned. And they even built a drive-up motel near the Park Service campground. And then, on September 8th, 1936, right around the time they were starting to reconstruct the lodge, the temporary dining and rec hall burned down. This place is just cursed when it comes to fire, apparently. But that wasn't the only issue that the Utah Parks Company and the construction company would run into. They had believed that the stone parts of the original lodge could be incorporated into the new one. However, when the masons tried to repoint the stone, so put in new mortar, it would start to crumble because it was just too heat damaged. Some of the stonework was able to be salvaged, though, which, funnily enough, included the 3-piece lintel for that outdoor fireplace. And the foundation was undamaged. But with the loss of most of the existing building material, the construction company, who had won with a $100,000 bid, would now have to acquire more material than they initially thought, costing them, and therefore the Utah Parks Company, more money. I would theorize that this is why they had Underwood and another architect redesign the lodge, ditching the observation tower and leaving off the 2nd floor, which wasn't necessary anymore anyway since they'd built an employee dormitory. The new lodge would also incorporate more stone and use steel beams for structure instead of wood, but they were encased in pine to keep the rustic look. The roof, which was covered in wooden shingles, was also pitched steeper to handle heavy snow loads. No 2nd floor meant that the ceiling could be higher, making this smaller building still feel spacious. And Underwood's grand triple-window sunroom would still be used. By early November, the exterior was finished and the men had started to work on the interior, but progress was delayed for a little while due to cold weather, snow, and men going to vote, according to the project manager. And though they did get back on track, things were about to get difficult. By the beginning of 1937, the roads had become totally impassable thanks to 12-foot-high snowdrifts. Fortunately, the men had all the building materials that they needed already on site. Unfortunately, they only had enough food to last until February. But apparently, the decision was made to just keep working. Then, when they were almost out of supplies, a rotary snowplow was finally dispatched from Flagstaff to go open the road. It broke down on the way, and they had to send another one. Meanwhile, several men had had enough and decided to hike down North Kaibab Trail to Phantom Ranch and take mules up to the South Rim from there. I believe one of them said something about having had enough beans to last for 3 years. Obviously, they were having to ration things. Help did eventually arrive for the rest, and the lodge was finished, opening in July of that year. Other than being closed for most of World War II, it would serve guests for the next 88 years. though it nearly underwent major changes between 1956 and 66. This was during the time that the Park Service was working on their Mission 66 program, which was an effort to modernize all their facilities in time for their 50th anniversary in 1966. And there was serious talk of turning Grand Canyon Lodge into a visitor center and office space, and replacing the cabins and campground with 2-story motel units. This was around the time that the Bud Ugly, Thunderbird, and Kachina lodges were being built on the South Rim as part of this Mission 66 initiative. But thankfully, it was determined to be too expensive of an undertaking, and thus the North Rim was saved from a mid-century modern makeover. But then the Park Service tried convincing the Utah Parks Company to build more cabins, which also didn't happen. And that was because they weren't getting enough business to warrant a decision like that. Then, in 1971, the Union Pacific stopped busing passengers to the North Rim. And so, due to a clause in their contract, the Utah Parks Company donated the entire complex on Bright Angel Point to the Park Service the following year. Since then, various other concessionaires have leased the property. In 1987, Grand Canyon Lodge was made a National Historic Landmark. And in recent years, it was considered by architectural historians to be the most intact historic rustic lodge complex remaining in all the national parks. That was the story of Grand Canyon Lodge. Hopefully it was as interesting to you as it was to me. Please check out my social links in the description, and I'll see you next time.